Welcome, welcome. It's really lovely to see such a packed hall tonight. And to begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country. We meet tonight on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Here at the University of Sydney, this year we celebrate 175 years of serving the community as Australia's first university. We honour the founding knowledge of our custodians of the land upon which the university's campuses are located. So welcome to Sydney Ideas, the university's flagship talks program. My name is Avril Alba. I'm a Professor of Holocaust Studies and Jewish Civilization in Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies here at the university, and the head of the School of Languages and Cultures. And I'm your host for tonight's event, An Evening with Sir Simon Schama. It is indeed a great honour to host tonight's event, I'll admit to being a fan, and to be in conversation with our guest. Now, I don't think he actually needs much of an introduction, but for those of you who aren't as familiar with his work, Sir Simon is joining us from Columbia University, where he's the Professor of Art History and History. He's an acclaimed historian and writer, and if he looks familiar, it could be from the over 50 films for the BBC, with topics ranging from American politics to the history of really anywhere in the world, art and culture. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you.
And it's wonderful to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
So tonight we are focusing on Jewish history, Holocaust history, and we'll have some time to look at our current moment as well. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions, and even the ones that submitted comments. Thank you for those as well. But we will only have time for a selection, but what we've attempted to do is weave a lot of the topics that people were interested in throughout our talk tonight. So I hope we'll hit a lot of the bases that many of you were interested in. We're going to begin in the most tragic past with it, which is of course the Holocaust. I guess where I want to begin is you've just finished this film. We have many Holocaust films. We have Holocaust museums, memorials, education programs, and we have the rise of global anti-Semitism. I want to hear you comment on that and why you made this film now.
Yeah, well, exactly as your hunch tells you, Avril, it is because of this crushingly worrying paradox that there's never been more Holocaust education, and we are dealing with a kind of tidal wave of crude Jew hatred. Which we'll talk about its relationship to anti-Zionism, I'm sure, in a bit. Making this one film was the BBC's idea. There have been a slew of programs commemorating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, but I was working on another television project, and I clearly couldn't have done that in time. So all these issues about commemorative timetabling were not part of it at all. And I felt this was, it's Beckett, fail better. I thought at the same time, many things went through my head. I thought, like a lot of other people, really not another Holocaust program, really? Do we want to be doing that? On the other hand, of course, and this isn't in the slightest bit meant to be any kind of criticism or complaint or even demurral about Holocaust education. One thing we know for sure, even if there's terrible problem about parallelism between anti-Semitism and Holocaust education, is the fact less Holocaust education is not going to solve it, not going to be a good idea at all. But I have been feeling, really, for a while, and I'm not the only person, it's not an original thought, it may be, you and I have talked a bit about this, the things, and there are fine historians of the Holocaust of the more recent generation, like Dan Stone and Christopher Heath in particular, who've commented on this, that the mass perception of the Holocaust, for entirely understandable reasons, is a matter of the axis between Anne Frank and Auschwitz. And there's something slightly incomplete, which is inevitably going to sound like the demurral I said I wasn't going to register. But let's start with Anne Frank, and then do disagree with me. But there's an extraordinary book by the young novelist Dara Horn called People Love Dead Jews, an incredibly confrontationally rather brilliant and bitter title. Which is about Anne Frank having been basically annexed by people understandably desperate to see some grain of human uplift. So the quotation from the Anne Frank diary, which is ubiquitous, is, despite everything that's happened, I'm paraphrasing badly, I know in my heart that humans are good, words to that effect. And there's an earlier, if you're interested in some sense, what became of Anne Frank, a setting, establishing kind of paradigm for thinking about the Holocaust. And we can talk about the Dutch experience, which itself is the whole history of memory in the Netherlands, Netherlands having had the highest rate of extermination of Jews in all of Western Europe. There's a wonderful essay, which you can read online, free, written in the New Yorker by the great novelist and Yiddishist Cynthia Ozick, called Who Owns Anne Frank? And that was more or less Cynthia Ozick's complaint that really, I mean, Dara says very, again, bitingly that, yes, you know, Anne could think of humans as good at heart until the humans who came to betray her showed up at the front door. And that is somewhat the gravamen of many of the things that Cynthia Ozick said. Cynthia Ozick traces what Otto Frank, her father, the only surviving member of the family, did with the memory of Anne, not in any sense of crude exploitation at all, but, you know, he wanted there to be a play, and writers were hired to do the play, and there had to be not exactly a happy ending. No one was disguising the eventual fate of Anne, but something redemptive had to come out of the story at the expense of the character of the diary itself, which I expect almost all of you have probably read. But you'll realize that, you know, as time goes on and Anne grows up, the diary becomes darker and darker and more distressed and more aware of quite terrible things, indeterminately defined, but deportations clearly were going on outside the, outside the place of her hiding. So what those who have this feeling, and it's a feeling like everything else associated with Holocaust memory that you wrestle with, you don't want people not to read Anne Frank, you don't want people simply to be absolutely shrunk into a deep well of apocalyptic fatalism either. But so Anne Frank is the touchstone for universalizing the Holocaust, making it in some ways something which can be globally usable, that it can be a kind of story for of redemption out of some sort of cruelty. In other words, those critics say that what has to happen to Anne Frank, really, is that she basically, her being Jewish isn't really a major part of the story. And it was an extraordinary moment, I think Dara describes, where one of the people working at the Anne Frank house, again, very well run in Amsterdam, came to work wearing a kippah and was told to take it off when he was working. Yeah, extraordinary. Lest it be too ethnically specific, and you know. At the Auschwitz end, again, you go there, and I went for the first time. It was extraordinary. I mean, again, the director wanted to make a bit too much, I think. We haven't finished the edit. I don't really want to make anything of it at all, but it's a fact that when I was working on landscape and memory and I was living in Poland doing research, I went to, I stopped off at Krakow, and I don't know if you're there then, so this would have been in the 1992 or something like that. And you got off the platform, and what greeted you on the platform was a large, welcoming tourist poster that said, day trips to Auschwitz, guaranteed back in your hotel in time for tea. Which I thought, okay, I'm never going to do that, really. And I think part of me has sort of resisted Auschwitz, I suppose, is kind of packaging of the Holocaust. Part of me, the historian, which is odd, really, because one of my lovely mentors, Richard Codd, the French Revolution historian, had a phrase called the archive of the feet, which is you need to tread the place you're writing about. And I've always believed that. But in the case of the Shoah, I just always felt that being there couldn't possibly really somehow embody the enormity of the actual experience. So I didn't want a kind of determined, that's sort of silly, isn't it? And I mean, I could talk about what I did feel when I was there when we were filming. But you don't want, again, if you go to Auschwitz, I don't know how many of you have been, it's a long way, now coach, bus, load of students, one after the other come. You don't want them not to come.
No.
But then they shuffle past the vitrine, shown at the end of the Zone of Interest film, full of shoes and spectacles and so on, and prosthetic limbs and all the rest of it. And there's a sort of odd, I don't want to say mechanical, again, it's too harsh. It's a sort of oddly automatic pilgrimage, really.
Well, I guess it's the difference between what you demonstrate or are trying to demonstrate in that film, which is the intimacy of the killing, really, and that the fact that in those shootings, people are meters, if that, apart.
That's right.
And that you lose that in that distancing, right, and in the
there is a sense in which a machine called the Nazis and the factoriness of the gas chambers and the crematoria is sort of, and how many films about Auschwitz, which is true, but not entirely true, that the cattle cars arrive at night and they're screamed at and dogs are, thrown at them. But most people actually arrived at a day. The film was made, again, finally, as usual with me, 10 minutes later I get around to answering the question, surprise, is that the enormity of the Holocaust was so many things more than both Anne Frank and Auschwitz. 1.5 million more than that. Jews, pretty much all of Polish Jews really were dead by the middle of 19... Yes, 42. Exactly, by the end of 42, absolutely. And this was set in Lithuania, as I said, particularly both near Vilnius, but also near Kovno, Kaunas, because the Steinbergs, my mother's family, actually my mother's family lost members, not there, but at Mauthausen, they were Viennese. But because that Lithuanian world, which I've been to before, was deeply sort of embedded inside me and interested me, but also because of exactly as Avril said, the so-called Holocaust of bullets was done by shooting. At least 250,000 Jews were shot in broad daylight, often in front of witnesses, very often by Lithuanian shooters with SS guards standing around them. The Germans enter Kovno in the last week of June 1940, and in 1941. We don't think really of the Holocaust happening so murderously in 1941. Germans enter Lithuania towards the end of at the end of June 1941, and the first thing that they do in Kaunas is to open the prisons to ultra-nationalist Lithuanians, who then round up. Well, first of all, they give permission to those Lithuanian partisans to launch a terrifying pogrom in Kaunas, but particularly in the sort of Orthodox area just over the river in Slobodka. And they head for the chief rabbi, the rabbi of Slobodka's house, who's reading the Torah, and they cut his head off and put it on the Torah and put the cut head with the bloody Torah in the window, people to see. The next 2 days later, Jews who had been part of the Soviets' occupation, but pretty much any Jews they could lay their hand on, to about numbering 70, are taken to the car park of a garage called the Liutkis garage, which is still there, not under the same ownership, in Kaunas. And they are beaten to death with iron bars, enormous poles and bars, into a pulp with hundreds of people standing around. And the Germans take photographs deliberately of the witnesses, the spectators, as we should call them. Not only do they take photographs of the spectators, but they actually rent a low-flying single propeller airplane, where a cameraman is actually hanging out of a helicopter taking photographs of this horrific massacre, just days after the invasion. Why? Because the photographic material is sent to Hitler himself, actually, and to Heinrich Himmler in Berlin, because the whole early experience in Lithuania was meant to be a kind of experiment to see how eager the local population was going to be to kill Jews. The Einsatzkommando were just, a few thousand, right, altogether.
Yeah,
each unit was sort of a couple of thousand at most.
Yeah.
So this was, much clapping of hands and rejoicing in Berlin that we can do what we want to do, what we've said rhetorically we will do, cleanse this whole world of this part of the world of Jews, because we'll have such enthusiastic collaborators. So this part of the Holocaust, really, which, as Avril said, is in daylight. It is person to person. It is a few meters. It is a terrible place, which ought to be as well known as Auschwitz, called Ponar Forest, just in the outskirts of Vilnius, when we went to, are these pits which were dug by the Soviets for fuel tanks, which they had to retreat, and which was the site of the mass murder by shooting of between 70 and 90,000 Jews, just 10 at a time, so office hours, 9 to 5, bang, 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 falling into the pit. Children don't waste bullets, just throw them in. They're smothered by the weight of between 10 and 15 layers of bodies. So we had to decide how deep and dark this film was going to be, and how much we could actually also, which is a much more humane part of the film, lest you think this is just full of horror and tragedy, which it is. I was very struck by the incredibly clever, in so many ways excellent Zone of Interest film of Jonathan Glazer, but it was completely Jew-free, wasn't it? Absolutely not a Jew in sight. And the notion that Hess, the commandant, rides up to the edge of Auschwitz-Birkenau and just looks over. It's ludicrous. He's going through. So this is a kind of daylight Holocaust, really.
And I'm intrigued by what you just said, there's not a Jew in sight. And I think one of the other things we've spoken about is the fact that we teach the Holocaust a lot of the time as if it's on another planet out of Jewish history.
Yeah.
And this, how do we teach it as part of Jewish history without it eclipsing Jewish history?
Right.
Is, I think, something
Exactly.
that you've really touched upon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I very much wanted to do because for exactly the reasons. And of course, actually, we have 1 hour excruciatingly. We're hoping we might be able to make a 90-minute film for cinema theatre presentation. I'm really hoping. Any of you sugar daddies out there? Jews will do that, won't they? But 60 minutes is brutal. But this was a very important part. Prima Levi is, incredible master, Elie Wiesel, and so on. But there's an amazing, Avril knows much more about it than I do, but there is such an extraordinary literary richness of Holocaust writing and music as well, which is actually weirdly better known now almost than writing. And the writing comes overwhelmingly, or very often, there are exceptions, like the poet partisan Avram Sutzkever, an incredible poet in Yiddish, very well translated. But most of those who wrote are not survivors, were not survivors. And they knew they would not survive, and they were desperate that their writing would survive. I'm just trying to sell a radio program to the BBC, actually, just of these extraordinary kind of literary voices. There's a man in the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, pretty much not many people have heard of, called Chaim Kaplan, who comes from a religious background. He's actually a teacher, very, almost surprisingly, of modern Hebrew in Warsaw. And he keeps an astonishing diary, which was published as, you can find it in antiquarian shops. I think someone said they could still find it on Amazon, actually, called The Scroll of Agony. That's a phrase he uses, but he doesn't. So it's an account of day by day what is happening. And it begins in September 1939. It begins from right the beginning of the war in Poland. But his kind of window into the gradual destruction of Jewish life in Warsaw, which he sees as a kind of heartbreaking epic, really. I mean, he's so moving about that. And as a picture of actually what the utter panic that happens when deportations start in the summer of 1942 is just absolutely unforgettable. There's another group inside the ghetto that many of you might have heard of, called Oyneg Shabbos in Yiddish or Oyneg Shabbat in Hebrew. That's an underground group of writers and journalists and a few businessmen, but mostly also led by a historian with whom I shouldn't presume, but because of that professional connection I feel very kind of close to, called Emanuel Ringelblum, is had been a student of the great socialist Bundist, I think, is that right? Historian Simon Dubnow. And Ringelblum is in his 30s, I guess.
He's young.
He's young, isn't he? And he gathers what they do, essentially, is to set up a kind of parallel clearinghouse of information from the blocks inside the tenement and building blocks, overpopulated, just dying of outbreaks of typhus, food, and so on. So this information is collected as a matter of record and then brought to bi-weekly meetings, I think. I always get about twice a week, I think.
I think that's right. That's right. And especially in Shabbos.
Right. And they're an astonishing group. And at some point, like Chaim Kaplan, they know they're not going to live to see this out. Some of them actually die in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Ringelblum dies just a little bit later. He's betrayed. He manages to get out, I think, doesn't he? But they're an astonishing group. And the archive itself is hidden in steel boxes and in milk churns. And one of the group, there are 60 of them, one of the group is a woman called Rachel Arbach, and she survives, actually. And she, in 1946, has amazing archive news footage. Have you seen it? Yeah, it's quite, I think Jan Basham has it. She takes them to a hole in the ground, and the milk churns and the steel cases are brought up, and the journals and diaries or everything are in not good shape, but much of it is in amazing shape. And they too are astonishing. There's a woman who is a non-Yiddish speaker, the only one, called Gustava Jarecka, who is a sort of elegant, acculturated Jew. And she has this beautiful phrase about what they're doing. She calls it, assuming again someone will find it, somehow. She calls it a stone hurled under the wheel of history, which is the most beautiful thing.
It is.
And those are, so we're part of our mission to ourselves. And there are many other people that one could tell you about and who have not enough time in the film because we only have 60 minutes. Those are the people I wanted to, shake Jonathan Glazer and trap him in a room and show him these faces and read these texts to him and say, look at them. They're not invisible. They're not just kind of, bits of body that are going to be gassed and burned.
Yeah, and with that in mind, I want to move us to our next topic, which is that you have written the stories of Jews. You've written 2 massive volumes, and you're now on the 3rd. But you come to finishing the 3rd at probably the most tumultuous time in Jewish history. And I think all of us are thinking, how do you write this now in light of the events of October the 7th? How do we think about Jewish history in light of the events of October the 7th and the unfolding war?
Yeah. Why are all the questions about Jewish history so,
Difficult.
aggravatingly profound?
Yeah.
Not my predecessor, I never know him, but the great historian at Columbia University of Jewish history is called Sela Baron, and he wrote an 18-volume social and religious history of the Jews, which is an astonishing masterpiece of scholarship. It's not light reading, but his famous motto, much commented on, much cherished really by anybody doing Jewish history, was an attack on equating Jewish history with what he called lachrymose history. And I had that very much in mind, almost kind of motto on my desk when I may have said that in volume 1, Finding the Words, that I did want to write a Jewish history that was not, as I think I slightly egregiously put it, a highway to Auschwitz, really, that was celebratory, that was full of a sense of wonder and marvel at many, of which our history is absolutely crammed. You read, for example, Sephardi poetry in Moorish Spain. You read Yehuda Halevi and so on, and you just are profoundly joyous, really, in reading anything so extravagantly beautiful. You think about Maimonides and the wonderful letter where he kvetches about, being a doctor and being at the beck and call of the viziers and the caliph and so on, and there are always people waiting for him.
Trying to be at the beck and call of the
exactly,
Jews.
exactly, and at the same time answering the deepest questions about whether or not it was a sin to affect conversion to avoid death, and bless him, he answers tolerantly and humanely, saying, no, it isn't under extremis. And you sort of go through these moments, even in volume 2, it's slightly perverse of me, but the most famous Jew in late 18th and early 19th century England was a boxer called Daniel Mendoza, who Peter Sellers, the actor, claimed was one of his ancestors. He's no longer, I would love to be able to quiz him about that. But the Daniel Mendoza story was really extraordinary, and a story of kind of muscular delight, I guess. I mean, his whole mindset is a bit like, one has to say, Muhammad Ali, in that he knows that he is a kind of prize fighter whose boxing matches are with the blondest, most non-Jewish, most extravagantly Gentile figures you could possibly imagine. So he was being set up in this kind of tournament of race and religion, really. And he seizes this and writes a book called The Art and Science of Pugilism and so on. So there are all sorts of moments from, very highbrow to kind of quite, as it were, sporty lowbrow and so on. And so again, a very annoyingly digressive answer to your question, but this not that the first 2 volumes hold back on the massacres of the Rhineland in 1096 and the First Crusade, or what happened in the most acculturated, sophisticated Russian Jewish city, namely Odessa. I don't hold back on any of that, of course, but I didn't want it to be the determinant, really. And then, as you say, and I had other things to do. I don't know, another kind of odd procrastination about. I think I always thought, never mind October the 7th, I always thought for some years. Volume 2, called Belonging, came out in 2019. And I think I always sensed uncomfortably it would be impossible not to be lachrymose, as it were, not egregiously. I don't mean that way, and I still believe that. They're planned. I only barely started writing it, but there are chapters which are absolutely not about the highway to Auschwitz. For example, the discovery, in heavy air quotes, the Ethiopian Beta Israel community in the early years of the 20th century. That's actually, the book starts with the so-called Report from Now, which is about trying to answer the question you put to me. And then the first chapter of the narrative proper is set in Gondar in Ethiopia with Jacques Feitlovich, the kind of quasi-Karaite, amazing ethnographer. There is a whole chapter on Irving Berlin, which I have actually already drafted. But on the other hand, I think I always felt that, well, it's ridiculous. You can't possibly make light of this ultimate catastrophe in the fate of the Jews. So you have to come to terms with that monster of history, really. The first chapter, which I'm sure I'll rewrite, and I have actually drafted it, is called A Report from Now, and it is really about the unwelcome surprise of the return of anti-Semitism and the morphing of anti-Zionist rhetoric, attacks and criticisms on what the Israeli government does into what you've had in Sydney. Well, there's a high school not in Sydney, in Auckland, in New Zealand. I mean, the catalogue of horror just goes on and on. That was actually daubed. I don't know how long ago. Did you notice that? It's called Genocide High School.
Yeah.
The kids came to school that morning, and it said Genocide High. But the caravan with all that explosives and the list of Jewish targets, these sort of endless fuck the Jews kind of things daubed on, the ripping of posters of children who are hostages, kind of proxy death second time round, the kind of eagerness really with which the whole legitimacy, the existence of Israel was said to be called into question by the Gaza war and so on. So I've tried really to talk about actually being rather sideswiped by that and having had, as in so many ways, the luck of timing of when I was born and when I grew up and a charmed life and very seldom being exposed to the possibility of our massive dehumanization.
And I think that's the surprise, right? That people are feeling, and that you hear in a lot of commentators, that Jewish commentators that are writing about this particular moment, is you often hear the phrase, have we returned to history? Are we seeing a return to history? Are we seeing, in a sense, a return to Jewish persecution? And I know as a historian, it's almost too tempting to go down that road, because of course we try and look at contextualization, contingency, etc. But the Jewish mind, if I can say that, the Jewish mind, the traditional mind sees archetypes, right, and sees patterns in history.
I think you and I probably, very presumptuous to put words into your mouth or thoughts into your head, Avril, but we are torn. It's part of really good historical practice not to dabble in cheap analogies. In other words, however awful Donald Trump may be, he is absolutely not Adolf Hitler, nor even is the clever moron Elon Musk just because he does that. Whether trivializing the emblematic presence of horror, obviously hideous and deplorable and stupid and wicked in some way. So we kind of resist, we ought to resist the cheapness and instinct to really Third Reich everything. But on the other hand, you have to say it is not entirely wrong that Jews are now being singled out, is not the kind of phrase I want to use, that Jews have come in handy as an object of culpability for something else, namely the sins of imperialism. The great book that did we talk about David Nirenberg? I think,
yes,
yeah, we did.
Both fans.
So, and I'm always going around. He owes me so many royalties, this guy, really. But it is a remarkable, magisterial, extraordinary book, and a wonderful read, actually, of an academic called David Nirenberg, now at Princeton, was in Chicago, called Anti-Judaism, slightly coyly, not wanting, I don't know why it's not called Jew hatred or Jew phobia or something. Anyway, he calls it Anti-Judaism. And There was another very good book, which I keep on sort of saying people might like to read, about Jew hatred in pagan antiquity by Peter Schaeffer, I think, really. But Nuremberg's point, it can be summed up quite simply, and it is extremely compelling in my view. And that is that hatred of Jews and fears of Judaism has not historically simply been a kind of add-on, not to do with, well, Christianity really forbids us from lending money. We'll have this particular community who are not Christians, therefore they're very useful. And so it's not really kind of annex, but in Nuremberg's view, it's actually constitutive, that each culture that wants to establish its coherent and sort of exclusive identity, its monopoly of identity, needs the Jews as to clarify exactly the opposite. You need to have a group that represent and personify the absolute opposite, so you can sharply see your own collective difference. And this would be true. I mean, it does sort of work in a way for almost every generation. It works, obviously, for early Christian Jew-hating preaching, like the notorious sermons preached by John Chrysostom, the Bishop of Antioch, who was worried that, with good reason, that people went to that Christians would go to synagogues in Antioch at Purim, for example, because they liked the early version of what we later became a kind of Purim spiel, or they liked the liturgy or whatever. And John Chrysostom was at pains to say, no, be infected by this, by this awful religion, and also these people are in some biological way bizarrely unwholesome. That has, again, an extraordinary kind of early ancestral presence in Jew attacks in antiquity. But equally, Islamic culture, of course, begins with, some of it begins with the massacre of the Jews of Yathrib, which was renamed Medina. And in some of the street chants, some of the most horrible things to hear in some Palestinian demonstrations are Khaybar al-Yahud, again celebrating a famous massacre of Jews. So if you buy the Nuremberg hypothesis, which I kind of mostly do, you project it forward into modernity. And for example, if you're capitalists, you want to see Bolshevism. Henry Ford, for example, will see Bolshevism as part of the Jewish world conspiracy. If you're nationalist, like Edward Drummond at the time of the Dreyfus Affair, you'll see Jews as a sinister, kind of corrupt, criminal capitalist organization. So, it's exactly the condition that Herzl diagnosed, and indeed Pinsker before him, as a lose-lose situation. So we ask ourselves, what is the culture, particularly on university campuses, that is the kind of dominant narrative in many of the disciplines of social science and the humanities? And the answer is, decolonization, isn't it? And so there's a kind of need for, it's odd to me, of course, that in Britain, for example, so much of the ferocious grievance against the wickedness of empire it is not particularly self-directed, actually, at the British past. Instead, along come the Jews and Zionism and Israel, and it's seen as a paradigm of, in heavy air quotes, settler colonialism, even though Zionism does not have the one crucial defining determinant of what a colony is, namely a metropolitan home to go back to. And, there was, for example, the French in Algeria had no connection, linguistic or cultural, with language spoken by Berbers. The British, though they became extremely interested in Indian languages, had no unbroken connection with Hindi, much less Sanskrit and so on. They become great scholars of those. Whereas of course, Hebrew is reinvented as a vernacular language, but any of you know who go to shul, who went to cheder, who study, Torah, and so on, know very well that the Hebrew that is spoken is still, in its essence, the same Hebrew that you'll find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, but, the intoxication of feeling virtuous about decolonizing is then projected onto not just the grievances and, the many cruelties that have happened during the Gaza war, both to Jews and deeply to Palestinian civilians. It becomes a question about the Jews and about the existence of Israel itself.
And, we are now on a university campus. This campus has been rocked by the events of the last 18 months. Your campus has been rocked by those events.
Right.
And how do we go on and have a university that is a place where you can have protest, you can have debate? Yeah. What's the line? Because that's the line that I think
that's the only question you've asked me, which is not hard to answer.
I had to give you one.
Yeah, thank you. It's preventing students from going to class and teachers from teaching what they want. Just the other week, a course is being taught by somebody, actually, a colleague I don't actually know, but on the history of modern Israel. And I have no idea what his, I have no idea really whether he has even a political view, but and it was immediately disrupted by a Palestinian demonstration. I have no problem with the Palestinian demonstration happening in the campus, providing it doesn't stop students from going to this course and actually listening to classes. Because then, actually, if the latter happens, then the whole kind of integrity and moral purpose and, God knows, didactic functioning of the university disintegrates and collapses, really. So that is my red line. I believe 2 students were suspended, actually, as a result of this. But, I don't want to stop. I mean, I don't like hearing from river to sea, obviously, but I certainly wouldn't stop students from shouting it, really. As some people want, they regard that. Again, we're getting into the definition, aren't we? I noticed, I think Sydney particularly, but certainly University General in Australia wanted to say attacking what the Israeli government does absolutely is not anti-Semitic. I do it myself on a regular basis.
I think most Jews do. Yeah, we're critical.
Yeah,
people
exactly.
That way. Yes,
exactly. But actually, holding Jews collectively responsible for it, or suggesting that it's really unproblematic to rid Israel of 7 million Jews, that also crosses the line, I think. Yeah.
And this is, I'm going back to the hard questions now, but we are at a point where it's hard to see a future.
Yeah.
For Israeli Jews, for Palestinians. Do you? I know you have been a classic 2-state supporter.
Oh, since I was 14 years old, I think. Actually, yeah.
Do you see a future?
Well, by definition, there will be a future, but do I see
a future
bearable
future for peace? I should say, some kind of peace.
I think it's very hard, and I slightly, I hope it's not cowardly of me, but I answer the question not with a question in the way in which Jews do, but out of my own experience. I've looked for, over the last 15 years or so, for moments and places where Israeli Jews and Palestinians work together. And there are more such places and places than you would suppose. And I would just talk about 2 of them very briefly, if I can, and urge you to check them out online. They'll be glad I say that. One is a wonderful organization of schools in Israel, in metropolitan Israel, called Hand in Hand, Yad V'Yad. And there are 6 schools The one I know very well is one in Jerusalem on the Green Line, called the Max Rain School. But all the schools are taught in Hebrew and Arabic. The students' population of each school is Jewish and Palestinian. The governing board, which set these schools up, are equally Jewish and Palestinian. And I went to see them last June, I think it was. Yeah. And but I'm in touch with them quite a lot. And of course, not surprisingly, both communities had suffered horrible deaths and grief and trauma on October the 7th and in the war that followed, and in with the war in Gaza itself. But it's incredible, you know, schools in Israel closed down, obviously, and then they started to open about 3 or 4 weeks, about a month later, I think. Actually, Hand in Hand was one of them. In fact, I think it opened early. I think it was like 3 weeks, really, after sort of the end of October. And very movingly, it has a Jewish principal and a Palestinian deputy principal, this wonderful woman. And there was a lot of screaming and grief and crying and shouting and blaming and in rooms, and time was provided for that. And then they got back to classes. And when I was there, it was classes, and there was kids kicking football around and so on. It was very much and no one denied something violent psychologically had happened, but that life went on. The other organization I'll talk about quickly again, so you all rush back to your laptops, is called Eco-Peace, which is about ecological and environmental problems. And it was set up by an Australian, Gideon Bromberg, from Melbourne, I think, who's lived in Israel a long time now, so he's an Australian-Israeli. And there are offices in Tel Aviv and in Ramallah and in Amman. And it's not just that, again, the organization comes together on a practical basis, just doing something practical. I remember I asked our Palestinian director, Nada, you know, how do you deal with this nightmare of politics and the horror? And she said, we just have work to get onto that's about purification of water and energy exchange and so on. So, and Gideon's a great man, you know. And I found that very, very moving. And currently, in contrast to Gaza Lago, you know, Trump's insane kind of dream of, you know, repeating the grotesque vulgarity of his casino in Atlantic City, you know, a real blessing that he could bring to Gaza, as if they didn't have trouble enough. The Eco-Peace version is to actually slipstream in a kind of interconnected way IMEC, which is a kind of the answer to China's what's called Road and Belt and Road program. Yes. I think so, yeah. Pan-continental, Chinese-dominated, with IMEC will work from India, across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, through Israel, Egypt, you know, Lebanon and so on, through to the Mediterranean European world. And Gideon's vision, you know, it is crazy, utopian and everything, is that there should be, crucially at that interconnection, 2 ports which, you know, operate at commercially strategic places, and one would be Haifa and the other one would be Gaza. And inshallah, you know, who knows? That's what you hang on to. So you have to find a place where people are not simply screaming mutual extermination. They're not Hamasniks who want a Palestine with no Jews, or a Ben Gvir who wants an Israel with no Palestinians. Such places are wonderfully thicker on the ground than you might imagine, but all of us are living in trauma, so it requires courage. Chazak, chazak, when it's chazak.
As my mother would say, from your mouth to God's ears. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I hate to stop the conversation here, but I have to, because I'm getting the cue. And I'm going to ask our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Mark Scott, to come and give the vote of thanks.
Well, Sir Simon and Avril, what you have before you is a packed hall. There was such strong demand for tickets. As soon as the word got out that Simon Schama would be here and speaking, there were so many people in our community and the broader community who wanted the privilege of sitting in the hall, and it has been a privilege tonight. You felt the warm appreciation when you walked on stage, and then I think the appreciation manifested itself with the rapt attention of the audience for the past hour, listening in silence and in appreciation for two wonderful scholars in conversation together. This, of course, is what a university is all about. Practitioners who've researched and read and thought and travelled and wrestled with the complexity, coming and sharing ideas with each other, and sharing ideas with each other in a way that doesn't just test mutual thinking, but inform the insights of those who have the privilege of being taught tonight. And I feel like we've all been in a master class, and we've all had the privilege of listening and learning and gaining insight from careers of research and careers of scholarship. And I think it was wonderful in the second half of the conversation, just that sense of the wrestle that you're both going through now through your scholarship and your understanding of history, trying to interpret what we are seeing in the world and the reasons for that, the causes of that, what it means and what we must do as thinkers and leaders and members of a humane society in response to those challenges. And of course, those challenges have manifested themselves on university campuses in this country almost more than anywhere else. And the practical advice of Sir Simon to create an environment where protest can happen and there will be dissent, but where teaching and learning and free access to what universities are all about for students, the classroom and engaging with that, is protected as well. And that's exactly the kind of tension we're trying to manage at the university, to create a space for protest and dispute and exchange of ideas, but to let the hallmark of the university as a safe place and a welcoming place for all our students being absolutely paramount. So it's been a privilege for us to listen to you both tonight. There's homework, I think, for the room, as good teachers will offer. The first, I think, is we need to make sure that this documentary is seen on Australian television. It was an extraordinary 4.5 minutes, Sir Simon. It was really astonishing to watch that brief clip, and how much we'd appreciate to see your entire work. But the second part of the homework is clear too. We want to see the full 90-minute version, not the 60-minute version.
I'll pass it on.
Can the fundraisers in the room go to work? And we'll put you in touch if you can find the money to fund the film that Sir Simon still feels he wants to make out of that. It's been a privilege for us to hear our scholars engage with each other, share their ideas and their insights and their learning. I feel like we had the privilege of being here just to listen in as they were working their way through. It's been a very special evening. Will you join me in thanking Sir Simon Schama and Professor Avril Alba?
Thank you. Thank you.
Avril.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I just want to close with a couple of bits of information. For more information on Sydney Ideas, go to the website, sydney.edu.au/Sydney Ideas. Thank you all very, very much, and good night.